I have this app that has a warning of, it's a security thing. About every day I get a notice that there's a shooting, over on the west side here. There's somebody's ransacking cars, about every morning in the newspaper we read there's a murder in Columbus, or sometimes 2 or 3 murders in one night. And so in some areas of our country, it's just a horrible place to live. The social order is horrible in some areas. But in the time of Jeremiah, this social order was really bad. This social order was depraved. And Jeremiah was commissioned to deal with a social order that, in terms of religion, in terms of the law of Moses, was totally off track. He followed in a few years earlier. Manasseh was the king of Judah. Manasseh, just according to Scripture, he just shed much innocent blood. We have a debate in our country as to whether capital punishment should be the law of the land. And in most cases, the capital punishment applied to those people who are, who've murdered or done some awful deed. But if we were in a situation where, where innocent people were being killed by the thousands, that would be a description of what was happening or what had happened in that society. And Jeremiah came along at a point in time when Josiah was king, and Josiah was a good guy. He tried his best. He really tried his best to reform and get out of that Baal worship, and to have a moral, a decent moral environment, a good moral environment. But it's hard to turn a social order around just by one person, or maybe a series of folks preaching. And Jeremiah was resisted at every turn. In his own hometown, in his own home community, his own family resisted him. He was thrown in jail, and we went through a litany of all the problems that he encountered a couple of weeks ago. So we have Jeremiah here in these, beginning with chapter 2, speaking, preaching. His words are recorded here. And this is probably at the time of Josiah, who was a good king. And he was trying to do right. In fact, during the reign of Josiah, they found the book. Isn't that interesting? They found the book. They found the scroll. And when they read what was in the scroll, it kind of shook them up, because they were just completely off track. And so they that precipitated more reform, finding the book. Now, it hasn't been too many centuries ago until the world really found the book, the New Testament. From the first century this way, according to world history, Christianity degenerated exponentially. And during the Dark Ages, the Catholic Church kept people in the dark. And then some people found the book. And when they found the book, they were surprised. People were surprised about what it said, in the book. And that's probably the way it was at the time of Jeremiah. Now, in chapter 2 and following, the Jeremiah, as he spoke, as he recorded this for our learning, he talked about he gives some pictures of what was happening. And one picture was an unfaithful wife, a picture of a marriage breakup. He pictures Israel as being an ungrateful heir of the nurturing that God had provided. And then in the latter part of this chapter 2, there's kind of a courtroom scene presented, and God indicts the Jewish nation. So just diving into the second chapter. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying. Now, obviously, it was the word of the Lord. It wasn't the word of some opinion or somebody's opinion. It was the word of the Lord. Now, we get in trouble in this social order, even within the church, when we start thinking about the word of the eldership, or the word of the preacher, or the word of a group of people, if it's not totally consistent with the word of the Lord. And that's our challenge, to be sure that what we teach and what we do and how we live is according to the word of the Lord, and not some word of the Lord mixed with some prominent psychologist or some prominent preacher who has an idea that, if we could, since there's a decline in interest in religion in America, some preachers are about doing, having some gimmicks to get people in, a community approach, this idea of meeting people where they are. Well, I know a little bit about psychology, I know a little bit about education, and if you start out with the idea you're going to meet people with where they are, that's okay, as long as you see that they eventually understand the word. As those old preachers used to talk about, old Fred Dennis. Jimmy, you ever remember that name, Fred Dennis? Used to say if you draw him in with a hot dog, you got to keep him with a hamburger. Was that the idea was that you draw them in with something other than the word, then you got to continue to be more charismatic and more flamboyant and more whatever. Jimmy?
Many of these so-called preachers today say that the Lord speaks to them and tells them things, and people actually buy into that. Like the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. We know that was true, but the word of the Lord doesn't come to people today and speak to them and tell them you do this and do that. It's true, it's written word that we find these things, but many people buy into that and think that these so-called preachers, or whatever they are, have received a revelation from God. So it's sad because they don't read it.
Yeah, it's Friday. I didn't have to. I took a day off work and went to visit with a person that is involved in camp, not a board member, but a person involved in camp who had somebody in his encampment last summer, had some kids off the side talking to him about God speaking to them directly, separate and apart from the Word. And we need to get that straightened out, so I drove 90 miles one way to talk to the person that could have or is going to have to be sure that that doesn't happen again. So it's that concept that if it isn't the word of the Lord, it really doesn't amount to anything, in religion. Mark, you looked like you were about to say something. Oh, Marcy must have just nudged you there and you flinched. Okay. Sorry about that. So, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Go and cry in the ears of Jerusalem. Now, this really bad social order. Go down in the worst the worst area in the United States in terms of crime, whether it be there in certain areas of Chicago. Go down and you go down there and you cry unto them. Now that would unnerve lots of people. But what had God said in chapter 1 about his support for Jeremiah? He said he's going to be with him. So I suppose Jeremiah, believing in God and to every word of God, he realized God was with him. Go and cry in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, Thus saith the Lord. Now, he gets into some, picture language, some metaphors here. He says, Thus saith the Lord, I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth, the love of thine espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness. Now, God was married, is this right? The metaphor, God was married to Israel. Christ and the church have a close relationship. God was married to Israel. And he says, God says, I remember the kindness of thy youth, the love of thy espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness, in the land that was not sown. Now, just to be fair to Israel, was it a big thing for Israel, who was established in Egypt, even though they were in slavery? Was it a big deal for them to pick up and follow Moses to the Red Sea? Was that a big deal? Yes. That showed that there was some kind of commitment to God, right? Was it a big deal for those people when they were wandering in the wilderness and with limited food? How many of you like to have cream of wheat every day, every night, every noon, every week, every month? I mean, that was a pretty bland diet, was it not? Then they added some quail here after a while, but wasn't that was pretty bland? And sometimes they were without water, and Moses got in trouble with the deal with the water, and was denied the promised land because he did a misstep there with regard to the water, getting the water out of the rock. They were, and then when Moses finally got, down off the mountain with the law, according to Exodus 24:7, Moses read after he received the law, read to the children of Israel. And what was the book of the covenant, the covenant, the agreement between God and Israel? What was their reaction? Well, Exodus 24:7 says, that Moses read the book of the covenant he received from God, and the people said, "All that the Lord commanded we will do, and be obedient." Now that was that was the display of they said we're going to do it. That was that marriage relationship. And God says, "I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth." No doubt he was thinking about those kinds of things. "I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth, and the love of thine espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness." Now they faltered with the calf situation with Aaron. They faltered there. They were punished as a result of that. But the bottom line was they stayed with their faith. Now, not all of them, but lots of them did. Then he says, in the land that was not sown. I wonder what this wilderness was really like. We go down through the Scioto Valley and you see all the crops, the cropland, and the bounty that's on the farms and so forth. The corn and the soybeans. Was the wilderness cultivated and filled up with grapes, grapevines, and plum trees and crops? Well, obviously not. So we can be really critical of Israel, but that would have taken a lot of faith, particularly since they were used to a life of slavery and having a chicken in every pot, so to speak. Back, they seemed to be well fed in Egypt when they were in slavery. Israel was holiness unto the Lord. Now, when you read about the history of Israel, there are a lot of times they digressed, and they weren't holiness. Particularly, Jimmy mentioned last week the Judges, the situation there with that cycle of disobedience and then punishment and then obedience and then the cycle repeating itself. But Israel was holiness unto the Lord. God's perception was that that some of them, at least, were good people, holy. What's holy mean? Well, it has to do with integrity. It has to do with ethics. It has to do with being good. And the first fruits of the increase. So Israel was holiness unto the Lord, and the first fruits of his increase. What about the first fruits? When the Bible talks about the first fruits, what's the implication there? The first, huh? Yeah, the good. Yeah, the good stuff. Not the apple that's way up in the top of the tree that withered. The good stuff. And that's and all that devoured him shall offend, and evil shall come upon them. What did God do to the enemies of Israel when they come into the promised land? Well, obviously, we know what happened. God took care of them. He protected them. God is through Jeremiah is reminding them of all of this, that history between God and Israel. And then in verse 4, "Hear ye the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel." Now, when he says, "Hear O Jacob and Israel," he was probably referencing not only Judah, but also the northern tribes, most of which had been carried away into Assyrian captivity. And so he's probably alluding to that group of people as well. But hear the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob. By the way, that the word of the Lord is mentioned, I think, 150 times in Jeremiah. The idea of the word of the Lord. I mean, that's just a repetition. Hear the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, what iniquity have your fathers found in me, that they are gone far from me, and have walked after vanity, and are become vain. Now, in this, what's God saying there?
I think it's interesting that when it comes to them, and I've noticed this even when Paul was in Antioch of the city and talked to the Jews, he tells them the good things God has done for them. And then he comes to the problem that they got.
Yeah.
And Paul, he told them that God had led them out of Egypt, had conquered 7 nations in Canaan, had given judges, and he brought them all the way up right up to Jesus, that they were to believe in him. And so I think that's good for us to remember. If we're studying with somebody or something, or teaching them, talk about the good things they do and get their favor before you try to teach them something that they're doing wrong.
Teachers of the Jewish community oftentimes, not only Paul but others, oftentimes brought them back to their history. This is just to remind you of this is the way it was all those centuries, decades and centuries. Well, so when he says, "What iniquity have your fathers found in me?" He's essentially saying to the Jews, God is saying, what have I done? What have I done that's caused you to go into apostasy, go into moral deprivation? It's kind of like taking them to court. It's kind of like being a prosecutor here. Now, what have I done? Now, have you ever been in a situation with your kids or somebody, and you just in kind of you're exasperated? What have I done? What have I done that makes you do what you've done? God is essentially saying, what's the answer there? God hadn't done anything, right? He hadn't done anything to cause these Jews to be rascals. So he's kind of prosecuting them here. He's saying, what have I done? What iniquity have your fathers found in me? They haven't found any wrong in how, God said, you haven't found any wrong in how I have treated you. In that they are gone far from me and have walked after vanity and have become vain. Now that idea of walking after vanity and becoming vain, walking after vanity and becoming vain. Vain has to do with what? Being empty, worthless, of no account, of no good. When they left the God of heaven to worship Baal and worship idols, what good came from that? Name something good that came out of worshiping idols. Name something good that comes out of paganism. Well, Baal worship involved child sacrifice. It involved burning babies to death. You know, what good came out of Baal worship was a depraved worship where there was a lot of sexual deviation connected with it. Now, what good came out of that? I mean, empty, worthless, no good for nothing kind of thing came out of it was vain and empty, of no value, of harm to the human body, of harm to society, of harm to the nation. Well, neither. He's talking about, he's reminding of the emptiness, the vanity, the worthlessness of their practices. Neither said they, "Where is the Lord and brought us up out of the land of Egypt?" They didn't remember. They didn't remember their heritage. They didn't remember that, apparently, that they were brought out of the land of Egypt. They didn't remember how that God had led them through the wilderness, fed them, gave them water. They didn't remember that though that land was a land of deserts and of pits, apparently it was an awful environment, a land environment. They didn't remember that, and he's reminding them. Through a land that no man passed through and where no man dwelt. When they went into the wilderness, did they find a civilization? Did they find housing? Did they find where there were museums, where there were libraries? And they had libraries at that time, and in some of the civilization there. No, they didn't find anything of that nature. And through a land of drought and of the shadows of death, through a land that no man passed through and where no man dwelt. Can you imagine that whole group of Jews being sustained in the wilderness for 40 years? I mean, how many people would have been involved there? Some of you scholars. 3 million? I don't know. Think of how much food it takes to the congregation eats at a potluck, and then multiply that by 100,000 times for just one meal. They forgot that God sustained them in that wilderness. And he says, "And I brought you into a land, a plentiful country, to eat the fruits thereof, and the goodness thereof. But when ye entered, ye defiled my land, and made mine heritage an abomination." Wow. They come into the land. God gave them just turned the territory over to them. The vineyards, the cultivated fields, the springs of water, and so forth. And they didn't appreciate it. Achan didn't appreciate it, and what old Achan do? And Joshua just took them over in and took out Jericho. Achan got Babylonian garments and silver and gold and hid them in his tent, which caused some trouble.
Makes me think the children of Israel, they had lots of blessings right in front of them, and how today we have so many blessings in front of us, and do we complain like the children of Israel?
Yeah.
Instead of appreciating what we do have instead of what we don't.
And we could talk about that for a long time, about that idea. I mean, being lacking in appreciation. Whether it be kids throwing away most of their meals in the school lunch program. I don't care whether the lunch program is all that tasty, Well, I appreciate it, right? I mean, if you're pretty hungry, you appreciate turnips if you're hungry, or radishes or something like that. Well, yeah. And I brought you into plentiful land to eat the fruit thereof, vineyards already planted, and the goodness thereof. But when ye entered, ye defiled my land and made mine heritage an abomination. And how did that happen? Even before they got into the land, prior to getting into the land, prior to getting across the Jordan River, that situation with Balaam and Balak. You remember that? The Jews were attracted to the women of the area and attracted to the worship of the area, even before they got there. I mean, this was ridiculous. And the priest said not, "Where is the Lord?" Even the religious leaders. When the religious leaders are off track, man, think of the difference between back during the days of Martin Luther and the days of the Reformation, and think of what message that they missed part of it. Luther and others missed part of it, but think of the message that they gave to the world compared to the folks in those groups that followed them down through the years. Difference in the message that the modern day groups give. When you depart from the old paths, and that's a biblical idea, the old paths. When you depart from the old paths, you really get in trouble. The congregations that try gimmicks to attract people, gimmicks. Look at the history of some of them and see how they go downhill eventually. Because you just have to have more and more gimmicks if you depart from the old paths, you see. Well, he said, the priest, no good. They didn't say, "Where is the Lord?" Now, the idea here is, they didn't say, "What does the Lord say about this?" They didn't ask that question. What's the word of the Lord saying? And the pastors, the Jewish society was pretty well organized, wasn't it? They had leaders of communities. They had priests. They had prophets. They had elders, tribal kind of elders. They were set up to teach. I don't know what kind of schools they had, but they were set up to teach. They were set up as a society. They were set up to communicate their heritage to the younger generation. But when the teachers went berserk, religiously, morally, then of course it's over. Where is the Lord? and they that handled the law, they didn't know me. The pastors also, the pastors, those that are, in charge of nurturing the folks, also transgressed against me. And the prophets prophesied by Baal and walked after things that do not profit. Last week, and then there was a partial, Tim mentioned this in the sermon about the situation with Baal, Elijah dealing with the prophets of Baal. Think of that. One prophet of God, 450 prophets of Baal. I mean, Baal was really permeated that social order. And they walked after things that do not profit. That is, getting back to that idea of being vain and empty, useless, worthless. Wherefore I will plead with you. Now, see, it's that kind of that courtroom scene now. Plead with you, saith the Lord, and with your children's children, and I plead. Would the God of the universe necessarily have to plead and beg and plead?
King James says bring charges.
Pardon me? Bring charges. Okay. But the idea here is that when he brought those charges, he was wanting them to understand, to repent and come back. He says here then, wherefore I will plead or bring charges against you, saith the Lord, and with your children's children will I plead. I will pass over the isles of Chittim and see, and send unto Kedar, and consider diligently, and see if there be any such thing. Before we talk about what that such thing is, Chittim there in some of the translations mention Cyprus instead of Chittim, and then the other Kedar. One of these places, Cyprus, was to the west, and the Kedar was to the east. And he said, look to the east and look to the west. Look all over. And he said, you wouldn't find such a thing as this. Then what is that? Hath a nation charged their God, or changed their gods, which are not gods? Now he's indicating here, most of the nations had gods, and the idea here was they stayed with those gods, which are nothing, but they didn't change their gods. Hath a nation changed their God? Look to the east and the west. Have any nation changed their gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which doth not profit. Israel was when it was an obedient people, they were blessed abundantly by God. They were a glorious nation, and they gave it up. They gave it up for stupid Baal worship, stupid worship of the stars and the planets, stupid worship of other forms of gods that were perceived in that area of the world at that time. Be astonished, O heavens. I mean, the heavens were even, he's saying the heavens were even astonished at how ignorant and stupid and depraved you people, you Jews are. Be astonished, O ye heavens, at this, and be horrified, or horribly afraid. Be ye very desolate, saith the Lord. For my people have committed two evils. For they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters. Now, Jesus talked about living waters, and what did he say? What did he tell the Samaritan woman? He was the living water. God said, I'm the living water. And so you can imagine this. Let's suppose that the illustration is, here the Jews had an artesian well. You know what an artesian well is? Now, some of you young bucks wouldn't know anything about artesian wells. Harold, you didn't know about artesian wells. What is an artesian well? So, huh? It's one that you don't even have to dig for it. It comes up out of the ground. Pure, cold, really great water, artesian well. And God said, here on one hand, you had an artesian well. He didn't say artesian, but that's my description of it. He had a well that sprang forth out of the ground. You know, some of you have seen a spring, right? Hello? Huh? A spring? You know, and back on one of our farms when I was a kid, we had a spring, had spring water. You know, that spring water came down, the house was down here, a hill up here, spring water, and they had what they called a milk house. What was that? Well, they put, that water was cold, and they put cans of milk in there we didn't have refrigeration in those years. I'm old, almost as old as some of you. And let's finish this thought. And you've given up this water source springing out of the ground, and you go out here in the desert and you're digging cisterns and collecting water and putting it in a cistern, but it's broken. How dumb is that? Well, that's as dumb as leaving God and going over here and getting connected with some Baal or Ashtaroth or worshiping the heavens or something like that. So he's just pretty saying that word picture, it's pretty dumb to leave a source of water and going out here in the desert and digging a cistern, and then the cistern leaks. Dumb. That's what he was saying. Huh?
Good lesson as always.
Thank you. Thank you.